I spent $62,000 on a luxury family vacation to Italy, but when my mother-in-law invited my wife's ex just to reconnect, I silently canceled every booking and let them face the empty trip I left behind. I'm 34, and I had been planning this trip for 8 months straight. Not just planning, obsessing. Every detail, every experience, every single moment was designed to be perfect. This wasn't just another holiday. This was supposed to be the vacation that healed old wounds and made our families feel like one big, united whole. I worked overtime, took extra consulting projects, and even gave up buying a new car just to save enough money for this. $62,000. That was the price tag on my dream 3 weeks in a private villa in Tuscany, Italy, for 12 people. The villa looked like something out of a magazine, 16th century stone walls, an infinity pool overlooking rolling vineyards, a full-time chef, and a personal concierge. I arranged private wine tours, cooking classes, day trips to Florence and Siena, and even booked a small private concert under the Tuscan sky. When I showed my wife the photos, she cried tears of joy. She hugged me, telling me that I was making her dreams come true. Her parents were excited. My parents were proud. Her sister's family couldn't stop talking about it, and even my brother said he couldn't wait. Everything seemed perfect until 3 days before we were supposed to leave. We were at my mother-in-law's house for a pre-trip dinner. Everyone was laughing, passing around the printed itineraries I'd made. I was standing by the kitchen island, pouring myself another glass of wine, when my mother-in-law walked up to me with that smug smile she wore whenever she thought she was being clever. She placed a hand on my arm and told me she had a little surprise. She said she'd invited one more person to join the trip, someone who would make things more fun. I asked who she meant, and her words hit me like ice water. Your wife's ex-boyfriend. I actually laughed, because I thought she was joking, but she repeated it, calmly explaining that he had been such a big part of the family years ago, that he was recently divorced and going through a hard time, and that she thought it would be nice for old time's sake. She'd already told him about the trip, and he was thrilled. The room fell silent. My wife's face went pale, her father looked uncomfortable, and even my mother stared into her wine glass. I stood there holding the bottle, feeling something cold spread through my chest. I asked my mother-in-law if she was serious, and she smiled like this was a perfectly normal thing to do. We're all adults, she said. It's water under the bridge. I looked at my wife, expecting her to shut it down immediately, to tell her mother how inappropriate and insane it was. But she just looked between us with this pained expression, like she was afraid to pick a side. Finally, she whispered that maybe it wasn't the worst idea, since he was going through a tough time. That was the moment everything changed. It wasn't even about jealousy. It was about realizing that I'd never be the priority when it came to her family. That my effort, my money, and my boundaries could always be overridden by her mother's whims. I had spent 8 months and $62,000 planning something beautiful, and in one conversation, it was hijacked by someone who contributed nothing but entitlement. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just nodded slowly, put down my wine glass, and said I needed some air. I walked out to my car, sat there in silence for 20 minutes, and let the reality sink in. My phone buzzed with messages from my wife asking if I was okay. Her mother even texted me saying she hoped I wasn't upset, because she was just trying to do something nice. That night, I drove home alone. My wife came home later trying to convince me that it wasn't a big deal. She said her mother meant well, that I was overreacting, and that it would only be awkward if we made it awkward. She suggested setting boundaries with the ex on my vacation. I didn't argue. I just told her I needed time to think. The next morning, I made my decision. I told my wife I was fine with him coming. She looked relieved, hugged me, and told me she knew I'd understand. I smiled back. But inside, I'd already decided how this trip was really going to go. I spent that entire day methodically dismantling 8 months of planning. I canceled the villa, losing a $31,000 deposit. I canceled the flights, all 12 business class tickets. I canceled the wine tours, the cooking classes, the private concert, the luxury car services, and the prepaid restaurant reservations. Everything was gone. My wife knew nothing. That evening, she came home holding bags of clothes she'd bought for Tuscany. She was glowing with excitement, talking about the villa, the vineyards, the memories we'd make. I nodded and said nothing. For the next 2 days, the family group chat buzzed nonstop. Everyone was sharing packing tips and photos of Tuscany. Even my mother-in-law was sending long messages about how these are the memories that matter. And then, the ex-boyfriend sent a message saying how grateful he was to be included. I muted the chat and waited. Finally, the morning of the trip arrived. My wife was up early, humming as she packed. We loaded the bags into the car and drove to her parents' house to meet everyone. The excitement was tangible, suitcases everywhere, people laughing, talking about Italian food and sunshine. And then the ex arrived in a Tesla, of course. He stepped out wearing designer sunglasses and a perfect smile. My mother-in-law practically ran to him, wrapping him in a hug like he was a returning hero. He walked up to me, extended his hand, and said, "Thanks for being cool about this. I promise I won't be a third wheel." I shook his hand and said, "Don't worry about it." We all gathered for a group photo. I stood at the edge of the frame, and as everyone smiled for the camera, I realized just how done I was. When the photo ended, my mother-in-law clapped her hands. "All right, everyone, time to head to the airport." That's when I spoke up. "I need to tell everyone something," I said. The chatter died. Everyone looked at me. My wife's smile faded. "There is no villa," I said calmly. "There are no flights. There's no vacation." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the air out of the room. I explained that I had canceled everything. The villa, the flights, the tours, every last reservation. My mother-in-law laughed nervously, saying it was a joke. But I just looked at her and said, "No, I'm dead serious." Her smile disappeared. My wife's face turned pale. My brother looked shocked. And for the first time in months, I felt calm. I told them that when my mother-in-law decided to invite someone on the vacation I paid for without asking me, she made it clear whose trip this really was. So I gave it back to her, to plan however she wanted on her own dime. The fallout was immediate. My wife pulled me aside, whisper shouting that I was humiliating everyone. Her eyes were red with shock and anger. I asked her if she would have told her mother no, if she would have stood up for me. She didn't answer. She just looked at me with tears in her eyes. The ex-boyfriend, to his credit, tried to apologize, saying he had no idea it would cause problems. My mother-in-law snapped at him, saying it wasn't his fault. It was mine. She called me petty, controlling, vindictive. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "You're right. I am vindictive." Then I got in my car and drove home. The aftermath was nuclear. My phone exploded with calls and messages. My wife came home hours later, furious and crying. She said I'd destroyed everything, that her family would never forgive me. I told her I'd simply given her mother the freedom to plan her own trip. Over the next few days, everyone weighed in. My mother-in-law sent a novel-length text calling me every name in the book. My father-in-law said I'd been rash. My own mother said I'd hurt people who didn't deserve it. But my brother texted something different. He said that while my methods were harsh, he understood why I did it. He'd seen me working myself to death to make that vacation perfect, only for someone to spit on my effort. Even the ex called to apologize. He said he felt manipulated and regretted accepting. I believed him. He wasn't the problem. A month later, my wife and I finally had a real conversation. She admitted that inviting her ex was wrong and that she should have stood up to her mother. She said she'd never learned how to set boundaries, that her mother controlled her life since childhood. I told her I understood, but that I couldn't keep living like that. I couldn't be married to someone who'd always put her mother's comfort above my respect. She cried, saying she'd go to therapy and learn to change. I told her I'd think about it. We're now separated. Not divorced yet, but taking space. She said watching me cancel the vacation was the first time she'd ever seen me truly stand up for myself. She said she respected it, but it scared her. And maybe that's the saddest part. My mother-in-law still plays the victim. She tells anyone who'll listen that I destroyed the family, and chose money over love. But the truth is, the money never mattered. The villa, the flights, the concert, none of it was about that. It was about respect. It was about being seen as more than just a wallet. I didn't pay $62,000 for a vacation. I paid for clarity. I paid to finally see my place in my own marriage. And as painful and expensive as that lesson was, it was worth every penny. Some people call me petty. Others call me a hero. I'm neither. I'm just a man who got tired of being disrespected. Would I do it again? Maybe not. But I'll never again break my back for people who treat my effort like it's theirs to use. And that's the real lesson here. Respect costs nothing. But disrespect can cost you everything. So yeah, the villa in Tuscany still sits empty next month. $31,000 down the drain. But at least now, I know exactly who my family really is. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe respect should never be optional, no matter how much money's on the line.